Hey, Chirag, how's it going?
Hey, Sune. Good, man.
Awesome. Ready to go. Let's start up the pod. Hey, thanks everyone for joining us. Episode 4 here. This episode was inspired by a podcast that Chirag and I listened to, the Lex Fridman podcast, where he had on an amazing guest, and Annie Jacobson, who wrote a book recently called Nuclear War, a Scenario. And it was a very interesting interview, if not a bit scary at times. But I think my head went many times to one of the topics that they covered in the podcast of the actual ability for humans to make a decision to essentially end the world. I mean, if you're making a decision to send a nuke, you are essentially ending the world because that's just, I think, the only scenario that plays out as soon as one domino falls. I think it's game set match, and that's humanity. So,
Yeah.
I was gonna tee that up, Chirag, to talk about. I mean, I'm happy to jump into the pod, but anything you want to add before we dig deeper?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great starting point. Yeah, I think Sune mentioned that podcast to me and it sounded really interesting. So I went and listened to it as well. And yeah, it was riveting, a riveting discussion. And Annie Jacobson really comes across as super knowledgeable. And, I actually looked her up while I was listening to the podcast, and turns out that she's written a bunch of books, and a bunch of books that I've already heard of that I have been on my to read list forever. The one that particularly comes to mind is Operation Paperclip, about the project to bring over Nazi scientists during the Cold War to the US to work on our various nuclear and other programs. So anyway, she's written a bunch of really interesting books, and I think this one, even more so. But yeah, she kind of lays out the whole scenario, or rather the whole kind of reason that the nuclear system that we have exists, not only in the US, but in Russia and every country that has nuclear weapons. It was a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, I think the first topic that comes to my mind was sort of like how we even got here and the scientists involved. Imagine the decisions they had to make to even develop a technology that can cause such harm and destruction to the world, and whether there came a point where they're like, yeah, this may be super dangerous and maybe we should stop. And, whether they had that foresight and how many of them did, right? I'm sure there were detractors, but, it's, I guess, the nature of the beast when we get to objective setting of development of weapons to help us to win a conflict. You deploy scientists to create weapons that will help you to win a conflict. And I don't know that even when you give commands like that, you put guardrails on it and say, yeah, just make sure it doesn't kill everyone if we send one of these off. And, I don't think it's too far of a stretch for scientists developing this to think that, well, if we have the ability to send something like this and cause this much destruction, it's like, what about the retaliation back to us? And I think there's just so much bravado and kind of posturing associated with the first country, person, group to develop it having the upper hand, and damn be the consequences if anybody else develops it. And almost becomes unfathomable, I feel like, when you even just get into this like state of win at all costs, and it doesn't matter, like we'll figure that stuff out later, we just need to win the war. And I think there's so many lessons even in that before we even dig deeper into other topics about actually hitting the button to launch the bomb. Like what about even just the development of the bomb? Like, what do you think, man? Like, do you think these scientists like rebelled and revolted? Like, do you think there were some?
Yeah, I'm sure there were. I mean, I think the most recent movie, Oppenheimer, I'm sure it's fresh in everyone's head. It just won the Oscar for Best Picture. Kind of dives deep into the Manhattan Project, right, and the development of the first nuclear weapon. So yeah, I think there was some, especially Oppenheimer himself. Who had a lot of misgivings about it, but was so focused on getting it done because it was important for the U.S. to win the war. They were in a arms race with the Axis powers that they just kind of had to get it done. It was almost an inevitability that someone would develop it, right? So yeah, I'm sure there were others who were detractors, but it's one of those things where in the movie, and I haven't read the book, which it is on my list, American Prometheus, but it sounds like a great book. But according to the movie, at least, it was such an inevitability that it was going to happen. So it's tough because you could kind of look at it two ways, right? Like, yeah, that those bombs that we dropped on Japan killed so many people, but the people who justified say, yeah, but if the war continued, then many more people would have died. So I mean that's a moral dilemma right there, right? Like, do you drop those bombs on a civilian population?
Yeah. Well, and that was what, like, those were atomic bombs. Those weren't even like the megaton bombs that we've created
Right.
since then, right? Like
That's right.
they're not even. I mean, as horrible as those weren't as severe or as powerful as some of the bombs we have now, and we
Yeah, it's
see how
crazy
much
to think.
destruction. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, no, good points all around. I think naturally there has to be this debate, conflict that exists, especially as you're developing these technologies. And I don't know, when it comes to like that whole escalation, if you will, or like that mechanization of the process, right? It's like you just want to get to the state where you can essentially declare victory, that you have something that will be the end of a conflict, and you can wave that in the air and say, yeah, back off, or I'll just destroy your whole country. And it's a pretty compelling argument. It's almost like, you have the power to rule everything. It's almost like a little bit like the Lord of the Rings, right? Like you have one ring to rule them all, like, and that had to be in the mindset, and not thinking further down the road of what it would mean for society more broadly and for the rest of the world.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think she does get into it a little bit in terms of, the whole concept of mutually assured destruction. It held up for a long time, right? I mean, it's still holding up between the U.S. and Russia, and certainly with other countries as well. But she does make the point that it only takes one nihilistic madman with access to nuclear weapons for that whole system to break down. So at that point, it's so odd, right? The system that we set up, it's almost like a gentlemanly agreement that, hey, I have nukes, you have nukes. If we both launch, it's the end of the world. So we know neither of us is going to launch. But then all of a sudden, we have this crazy person and over there who suddenly has access to the same weapons, and you know what? He might actually launch.
Yeah, yeah. It's and the other really interesting point, and because Annie Jacobsen had access to so many people that were actually involved in making the bomb, and in fact, access to the person that hit the launch button for the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, right? What one other really interesting point she made was that when you have people that were so intimately involved in the creation and the aftermath of what happened after we launched our atomic bombs, there was a respect and appreciation that those statesmen shared and carried with them to their peers and through the culture of government and the military, that I think created a respect for the power of these weapons. And as generations have passed, that narrative and that same respect diminishes inherently because the voices aren't as strong. They're not as powerful because they weren't there anymore. And so it inherently becomes a weaker and weaker message. And I think that opens the door for more riskier behavior and less checks in place for people that can get into the ear of the right person and prevent something horrible from happening again. And I think that's similar across the globe, because it's been so many decades since these weapons were first created that many, at least 2-3 generations have passed, and that voice of, hey, let's like let cooler heads prevail and not actually get to this point may not hold anymore. And I do wonder, and I am concerned, whether if we had another Cold War scenario and Bay of Pigs scenario, would we have the infrastructure in place to resolve that the way in which it was resolved without anybody detonating any weapons? And we know we came super, super close
Yeah.
to having, nuclear war. And I do believe in my heart cooler heads will prevail. But yeah, I think the risk is greater now than it ever has been, though.
Yeah, definitely. And I think she goes into excruciating detail about how these systems have been set up, right? She called it, what did she call it? Like a system of mass genocide, essentially. And
Yeah.
we have these, what were essentially SOPs on on how this whole system should work, right? Like a flow chart of if a nuclear weapon is detected, launched from somewhere, that the president has 6 minutes to make a decision on whether or not to launch a counterstrike. And we do have interceptors, right, that can intercept nuclear weapons. But even outside of that, and we don't have many. She said something the U.S. has something like 44 interceptors, which isn't much considering there's thousands of nuclear weapons on both sides. But the president has 6 minutes to make that decision. How does a human being make that decision in 6 minutes, right? And once the process is started, can anyone step outside of that and say, hey, take a step back? Because all this stuff is going to happen so fast. Can anyone step back and say, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this? I think once that process is started, I think it's a done deal, you know?
I yeah, I don't know. I think I might disagree with you a little bit. I mean, I do believe that there is a chance that it reaches a person that has some morality and doesn't have the ability to push the button, because I mean, it's the end, like you're guaranteeing the end of humanity. Like that is a pretty daunting responsibility. And I get the counter argument, like this is what they're drilled for and they're only going to hire people that'll carry out the order, but nobody really knows until they're put in that scenario. And that's a really insane amount of stress, pressure, guilt to carry on yourself. I mean, I don't know. I still
Yeah.
think there's a chance that the system breaks down. I do. I really do. I think there's layers there that may still prevent something crazy from happening.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, it's so hard to say, right? Especially, yeah, you could put someone in that position who is going to follow orders, but when it comes down to it, you're right. I mean, how do we know? Like, you don't know how anyone's going to react in that. It's such a unique situation, right? That no one has ever faced, and probably no one ever will again if it does happen. Um, how do we know how anyone's going to react in that situation?
No, it's true. I mean, even just think about the 6 minutes for a president to make a decision about even giving the order. That's insane. How do you, like, what do you double check, right? Like, are you sure the
Hmm.
satellites are right? Can you get on the phone with someone and say, hey, did you really send this? Like, you want to verify?
Right.
Like, I mean, there's so many questions that would go through a human's head that you'd want. I mean, geez, I remember, even when writing an email, I think about is this the right word choice, right? Like, now you're
Yeah.
talking about the end of the world potentially, and you have 6 minutes to decide. Like, I don't know, man. That it takes a special person to be a president, and I think the more and more that I think about how important and significant this decision is, it gives you a totally different perspective and respect for people that want to hold this position of power in our country,
Yeah.
man. This is a staggering responsibility when you really think about it, and I think we've kind of grown so used to it being in the power of the president, and I think we've grown so used to peace that this power, this capability, I think has been diminished in its importance, but I think it's front and center now. Like, I think this is a pretty important criteria for me to weigh as I think about what I would look for in a presidential candidate. Like, this is an insane responsibility. It's a really, really insane responsibility, and you'd want level heads, and you'd want advisors, and you'd want really strong decision making to go into those 6 minutes. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, definitely. And around that topic, I mean, she had some really great points that she made. One was that, first of all, a lot of this is so super classified that the only way she was able to find out about the 6 minute window was through Reagan's memoirs, which I thought was really interesting. I think she also had access to certain people who are aware of the process, but like I said, it's super classified, so I don't think they're able to disclose as much as she would have wanted, right? So the 6 minute window, I think particularly she got from Reagan's memoirs. And even Reagan in his memoirs was kind of grappling with this himself, and how does a person make this decision in 6 minutes? So I thought that was really interesting. Certainly, like you said, the cognitive ability of a president has to come into as a factor in who I vote for in the future, because you're right, this is a massive responsibility. And even going back to what Annie Jacobson was saying, is that even presidents don't know sometimes. Like, she was saying something about how, the fact that ICBMs once launched can't be recalled and can't be redirected. And apparently in a speech, Reagan got this wrong. Like, he didn't even know
Right.
that once an ICBM is launched that it can't be redirected. So how can we as a public expect to have trust in a president when he doesn't even know what, like, that's a pretty major distinction on whether or not an ICBM can be launched, because I would have to think when you make that decision that that's in the back of your mind. Like, if you think an ICBM can be recalled, then maybe you're quicker to push that button. Whereas if you don't, right, I mean, that's a pretty big deal. I would want to know that the president would know that much, right? So yeah, I wonder how how much presidents are briefed on this and how much training they're given, right? Like, are they
Yep.
just kind of given this nuclear football and say, "Hey, go be with this, and if you have to launch a weapon, here are the procedure." Like, I feel like there should be more. Hopefully there is there's some training that goes along with it once you become president, that you're aware of kind of all the technicalities of launching and all that stuff. But who knows?
Yeah, yeah. The other interesting part was, the whole we've publicly stated that that 6 minute window is a result of us communicating to the world that the US will launch on warning, that as soon as our early warning detection systems go off, we will launch a nuke and back at the source of the missile. And for many, many years, I guess ever since they came up with their nuclear arsenal, Russia was not a launch on warning country. And Putin publicly changed that, I want to say a year or 2 years ago, maybe even less, to being in a position to launch on warning now. And that has so many implications because, like I was telling you earlier, our ICBMs that are launched from our country, from our homeland, don't have the range to travel to, let's say, North Korea without going over Russian territory.
Right.
And so now you've got a scenario where Russia would see a nuclear weapon go over their country and trust that the US is saying, "Oh no, Russia, this isn't intended for you. This is intended for North Korea." And just be like, "Yeah, okay, trust me." It's just silly and crazy, but what an interesting insight that was. And it just leads me to the point and the question for you, my friend, why the hell isn't there more outrage about nuclear weapons and how many we have, and why aren't we talking more about this, right? I don't know. It blows my mind when I learned about this stuff, and maybe it's the start of a public discourse, but
Yeah.
I'm surprised that there hasn't been more outrage since Annie's book.
Yeah, it's surprising. And I don't recall when the book came out, but, I do recall back in the 80s, there was a lot of talk about nuclear proliferation. And just to run down on the numbers that she mentions, the US has roughly 1,700 nuclear weapons deployed. The deployed meaning they're ready to be launched at any given moment. Russia has 1,670. And then amongst 9 other countries, there's 12,000 more. So that is quite the number, but it is less than it was. In 1986, there were upwards of 60 to 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. So,
Insane.
we've made some progress, but it's still an insane number to think about. I mean, that number, 12,000, is still more than enough to, destroy the world multiple times over. So it's not like we've gone from, 70,000 to 5, but there's still a lot out there.
Yeah.
Some of the details of it is kind of crazy, which is that most of the ICBMs that are launched, ground-based ICBMs, can be launched within 1 to 2 minutes max. And they can reach another continent. They can go from continent to continent in roughly 30 minutes. So, I mean, we're talking about the world can end within minutes, right? It's not, these dominoes like we talked about, once they start falling, can pretty much wipe out the world within a couple of hours, which is insane to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. And then all of the aftermath therein. And I mean, there's excruciating detail that Annie documents on what actually happens when a nuclear weapon goes off, and the radius of within 100 miles, what happens, and then a nuclear winter and all of that entails, and yada yada. And I don't know, I wouldn't do it justice, but I'll say this: I know I personally have no interest in surviving a nuclear holocaust, man. If it's happening, I'm going out and watching the fireworks, man. I have zero interest in wanting to survive a nuclear winter. That just sounds horrible and not something that I feel like I have the capability to live through.
Yeah, no,
I don't know about
absolutely.
you.
I completely agree. I think very few people would have that would have the interest in surviving that. And funny, we were talking about this before, and the movie The Road came to mind. It's based on the novel The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And having read that novel and having seen the movie, I mean, it is. I mean, they don't specifically state that's the result of a nuclear winter, but I think it's pretty clear that it is some aftermath of either a nuclear winter or some kind of environmental cataclysm. But essentially, the effect is the same, right? It's humanity is scattered to the wind. We turn into cannibals. Society completely breaks down, and I gotta say that's probably the most depressing book I've ever read. And yeah, I would have no interest in. I almost want to be in the middle of New York City or in the middle of Washington D.C. if that were to happen, and just go out, go out. You would never know it happened anyway. If you were in the middle of it. So
Well, you had, I mean, changing subjects a little, but I mean, this is I know you were super into the solar eclipse, and it just happened this past week, right? So
yeah.
curious about your whole experience there, and I know you went all the way to Niagara Falls, especially to go and witness it, and yeah, you were telling me how cool it was. So yeah, tell me again, tell the audience a little
Yeah,
bit about it.
yeah, sure. So yeah, I'll preface this by saying that I've been into astronomy my whole life, like ever since I was a little kid. I was super into astronomy. Anything and everything astronomy, I was always into. So, last year I read about the eclipse coming up in 2024, and as soon as I read it, I've always wanted to be in the path of totality, and I read that it was going to be relatively close, and I read it's going to be over Niagara Falls. So, that kind of just sparked my interest. So as soon as I read that, I actually went and booked a hotel in Niagara Falls. This was something like 8 months before the eclipse. I want to say it was like middle of last year and middle of 2023, or maybe even earlier than that. I can't remember exactly. But yeah, so I booked a hotel and we pulled the kids out of school because for something like this, it's totally worth it. And we went up to Niagara Falls and it was a fantastic experience. So, I've experienced partial eclipses before, but it doesn't really compare to a total solar eclipse because it is a completely different experience. It is the path of totality. You're literally in the shadow of the moon, right? For people who don't know, it's such a weird quirk of our solar system that the sun is 400 times larger than the moon, but also exactly 400 times further away from the earth as the moon. So it's such a weird quirk. This doesn't happen anywhere else in our solar system where these two bodies appear almost exactly the same size in our sky. So I find that super interesting. And it can only happen, there's something called an annular solar eclipse, which is because the moon's orbit is not exactly spherical, sometimes it's a little bit further away, sometimes a little bit closer. So in that kind of solar eclipse, it's not fully covering the sun, but in a total solar eclipse, it is completely covering the sun. So my point is that the sun is completely covered by the moon and you see this ring. And unluckily at Niagara Falls, it was a little bit cloudy, but what was great was being in a crowd and experiencing this kind of cosmic event in a group, and you could feel the energy. The energy was palpable, and it was really because it goes from day to night to day, right? Literally, like it became night for 5 minutes, and the temperature dropped 10 to 15 degrees. Everything got quiet. Streetlights turned on. It was, it was a surreal experience. But I highly recommend if anyone has a chance to experience totality in their lifetime to seek it out.
Oh, that's awesome, man. You could tell how much you enjoyed it just through that description. It's great. And, that experience, what you shared, being around a bunch of other people that are into it, doing it all in a shared experience, added so much, I'm sure, to the enjoyment that you had and the whole vibe and the aura and the energy that you described. It's pretty special. It's pretty amazing that we as humans get to experience that, have that connection with nature and the universe around us. And those are the examples that do give me hope when we talk about a pretty dark topic like we did today and how we have the capability to destroy all of humanity and civilization. And I do believe that the right decisions will be made to preserve our species, and that although we do have an escalate to de-escalate mindset when it comes to war, I still believe that cooler heads will prevail and our species will continue to thrive, and the right decisions will be made from a human, ethical, moral standpoint to prevent our mutually shared destruction. So that's my take. Maybe it's too optimistic, but that's the way I view it, man. That's what I
Yeah,
think, and I think you have to, right? I think we have
you
to
have
believe
to.
that. We have to have that faith.
Absolutely. I mean, we need more optimism in the world for sure, right? And I think let's be optimistic. And we came so close multiple times, right? I mean, you referenced JFK and the Bay of Pigs, and that whole scenario that we had. We came so close at that time, but somehow even with two countries in the middle of a Cold War, we still got through it, and cooler heads prevailed. And if I think if we can make it through the Cold War, I think we can. I think there's hope that there will be people in power, in positions of power, that will have the moral insight to know that it can't happen. Like, that just can't happen.
And it's worthwhile to have a discourse and have a dialogue about how the Cold War stayed a Cold War and not something into a true war. And there's got to be innumerable lessons that can be applied to the world around us now, where there is so much actual conflict and war erupting in pockets that is concerning. And I think historical examples of ways in which we've navigated to prevent wars from occurring in the first place are worth exploring and discussing and learning from again, because that's a much better use of human life than destruction of human life. So, and at the end, the outcome's going to still be the same. You're going to have to get into a room and discuss a trade-off. It's just a matter of how many people have to die before you actually figure out what your compromise is going to be before one party gives in. And, hopefully it's fewer than more. So that's, that's what I got, man.
Yeah, it was a great discussion, man. I'm glad we ended on a hopeful note. It's a topic that can get very dark and depressing really quick. But yeah, like you said, I think there's room for optimism, and I think let's keep the discourse going, and hopefully that spreads. And I think Lex Friedman is a great example. He's a very positive person, and he tries to spread a positive message. So I'd like to continue that and send our positive vibes out there to the universe, and hopefully that has a ripple effect on the universe.
Yeah, love your fellow humans, man.
Yeah, that's what it's all about.
All right, I think that's the pod.
That's a pod.
All right, thanks everybody. Good talk.
All right, that's the pod. Great discussion as always. We hope you enjoyed it, and if you want to join the conversation, email us at questioneverythingexcept@gmail.com. See you next time.